Welcome to Season 3 of Candid Leadership. Throughout this season, I'm taking recommendations from listeners like you to speak with leaders and mentors of inspiration. Today's guest was recommended by a listener from the nonprofit community. Brigadier General retired Mike Meese, U.S. Army retired, is the president of the American Armed Forces Mutual Aid Association, better known as AAFMAA, the longest-standing nonprofit that assists the American Armed Forces community with insurance, financial planning, survivor assistance, and other benefits. In 2013, after 32 years in the Army, he retired from his position as the professor and head of the Department of Social Sciences at West Point. There, he taught economics and national security courses that led the 70 military and civilian faculty members in the department, Combating Terrorism Center, and the Office of Economic and Manpower Analysis, who teach political science, economics, and terrorism-related courses. He has also served as a visiting professor at Princeton University, visiting Distinguished Research Fellow at the National Defense University Institute for National Strategic Studies, and as a member of the National War College faculty. He is a leader in military and veteran issues, including chairing the 2016 to 2017 transitioning team for the Department of Veterans Affairs. He has written and lectured extensively on national security and economics, including the books American National Security and the Armed Forces Guide to Personal Financial Planning. He's a graduate of the National War College, U.S. Military Academy, and holds a PhD, MPA, and MA from Princeton University. Mike, welcome to Candid Leadership. It's great to have you.
Well, great to be here. I appreciate it.
Well, your work with the American Armed Forces Mutual Aid Association focuses on military families and their financial planning. How do you encourage this position that you hold to prepare for the future for those military members?
It's interesting. Whenever I speak with either a military group or a group of veterans that have transitioned or in the process of transitioning, I try to have them think about their financial independence and security, which is really what American Armed Forces Mutual Aid Association, or we call it AAFMAA, is all about. Their financial independence and security is comprised of three different legs of a stool, all of which you need to think through. And this is true whether you're a soldier or a sailor, airman, Marine, joining the military, or somebody transitioning out. And those three legs are first budgeting, and then the second is saving and investing. And then the final leg is protecting what you have, which is really what we concentrate on with AAFMAA. To expand on those just a little bit, budgeting is what we all know. It's kind of the first leg of the stool. That's really having your own situational awareness of what your income is, what your spending is, making sure that you have that in balance, ideally with more money coming in than going out, and knowing where that's going to go in the future so that you can anticipate the various risks that you have with your financial situation and those kinds of things. The second leg of the stool, savings and investing, for people that have been in the military or are in the military, you have a predictable stream of income. Not only is your income set where you get paid normally twice a month and all of those kinds of things, but you actually know likely when your raises are built in. And there's a lot of things that you have as a government employee, such as the thrift savings program and other kinds of things that can put you on a predictable long-term savings and investing path, and then having some discipline on how to do that. And then the final aspect is to protect what you've got. For people that are transitioning out of the military, the most valuable thing that they have actually is their military pension and their retired pay. For newer service members, they're part of the blended retirement system, where they have not only the income that they have, but also the government setting aside at least some money for them. And we encourage all of them to put aside a full 5% of their income so that the government will match that 5% and they can have a nest egg for that for the future. In the meantime, in fact, that's where AAFMAA came in. Historically, we started out literally 142 years ago in 1879, because back in the Old West, when service members were out there, there was no kind of insurance and nothing to protect the families. If anybody died, what they did literally was pass the hat. Whatever money went into the hat, that's what the survivors had to live on for the rest of their lives, or to move back east and find alternative means. Well, in 1876, when Custer was wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn, there was nobody to pass the hat, nobody to pass the hat to. So the military formed the Army Mutual Aid Association. And my predecessor, 142 years ago, started an insurance program where military officers could put in money and have a mutual insurance program. And that's how AAFMAA was originally founded, as a mutual insurance program to be able to take care of other service members.
That's fascinating with the history. And the fact that it's continued on really speaks to the strength of supporting those military members and the fact the goodwill of the nation to be able to continue on. And thank you for holding that position. I think most recently, there was a military family life survey. It was conducted, and there was an important tool to understand how to meet the needs of military families. From your vantage point, having been in the military for a long time, understanding military families, what did you gain from this? And then how do you apply that to your role currently at AAFMAA, helping military families?
I'm glad you highlighted that. The Military Family Lifestyle Survey is really important, and I commend the folks from Blue Star Families in putting that together. They've now done that for over a decade, and it really helps put data combined with the anecdotes that we all know from service members that we work with. I have a son that's in the Army Reserve that's in Durham, North Carolina, and a son-in-law that's a company commander with the 82nd. And so I get their anecdotes of what's happening with them and my grandchildren at each of those locations. But when you combine that with the data that the Military Family Lifestyle Survey has, you learn a lot of important things. First big finding from that is that spouse employment is very, very important. 52% of the families of spouses identified that spouse employment's a top concern, and this actually got worse during COVID because of the difficulties of working from home and employment changes. I think a lot of what we try to do is encourage effective transition programs, employment assistance, and having common licenses. So when the military spouse moves from one post or base to the next, they're able to find good employment in the new locations. The other aspect that we find from that survey is that service members, as well as veterans in the Military Family Lifestyle Survey, identified that they have problems accessing benefits. It wasn't as much a problem with not having veterans or military benefits, but not knowing how to access them. And that's why what we try to do with AAFMAA is have a robust learning center at our website, www.aafmaa.com, so that people can learn how to access their veterans benefits, their military benefits, how to leverage the thrift savings program, as I mentioned, and other kinds of things, so that we have some relatively generous military benefits. And this helps individuals know how to take advantage of them to maximize what they have for themselves and their families.
You mentioned an organization as well. The Military Family Lifestyle Survey is at Blue Star Families, and their website is www.bluestarfam.org. And it's a great way to really look at those areas that over time where we can point out family needs. Having been a Blue Star family member for a while, I use that organization quite a bit, and I give them a solid hat tip for what they did for laying wreaths at Arlington, supporting those members, providing assets and availability. So, I mean, look at this. You've got a twofer in one podcast right now to talk about two great giving associations that help family members. Let's go back to the individual member in the military, having served, whether they serve just for their initial enlistment or sign up as a commissioned officer or all the way through an entire career. The transition is difficult. And what advice would you give to service members now, especially after leading AAFMAA or in your own transition itself? What advice would you give to those members?
Well, the first thing is it's really a challenge, especially for people who've spent a career in the military, to think about getting a new job. Because for better, for worse, the military gives you the job that you have. They give you the PCS orders from this job to the next, or some boss promotes you or moves you into a particular position. And you don't really think too much about anything other than kind of the personnel system way of getting things. But when you leave the military, whether it's after 4 years or 40 years, it's important to realize that getting a job is hard work. It takes time, effort, and discipline. Unlike those being in the military, we have friends and all of that kind of thing. But as a civilian, after you transition, you really, really need to network. I would estimate that at least a third to a half of jobs that military people get are not from LinkedIn or a job fair or those kinds of things, but are actually from connections that they make, having a cup of coffee or lunch with people that they know, getting to leverage their networks. And we don't do that as much in the military as happens in civilian life. And then you have to get used to doing those sorts of things. The final aspect of that is actually being relatively vulnerable. I know a fellow general officer who really had a very disciplined system. He went out and he actually interviewed with 52 different organizations, took about a half a day for each one of the interviews. He would go through all of these things. And then he ended up, the good news was he got acceptances from 13 of the 52 organizations they interviewed with. The other important thing to recognize was this was a highly talented general officer. He got rejected by 75% of the people that he interviewed with because it just wasn't the right fit. And so unlike those of us in the military where you go to some job in any case, you've got to be prepared to put yourself out there, recognize that some jobs may not fit for you and accept that rejection, and then pick yourself up, go on and keep trying the different places until you find that right job that's in the right fit for you.
Oh, that's a brilliant point, and I'll riff off that for a while. You pointed at one of my biggest pieces of advice I give to people, whether they're in the military or anywhere in national security. Really, you have to understand networking is not a dirty word. Connections are so important. In real estate, we say location, location, location. When we look at networking, it's connection, 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 and having those really hearty conversations. It doesn't always have to be so incredibly intense. I think we sometimes think of networking as like a counseling that you do in the military, and it has to follow a formula. Networking can simply just be a discussion. I mean, it can be in a sports bar. It can be at a kid's softball game. It could honestly be almost anywhere. But you do have to be vulnerable. You have to put yourself out there. For those of us out there who are introverts, it can be difficult. It can be a little challenging, but swallow that introvert part of yourself, become an extrovert for a little bit, and put yourself out there. Work towards building those relationships, and it may not always connect with the person that you're talking to at the current time, but always ask. It's the question of three. Who are three different people I should talk to? Three different articles I should read, books I should look at, websites, other companies. Because even though you may not be a right fit for them, they have a broader perspective necessarily than you do. And the insights that you have are incredibly important, and the skills that you have are as well. And so as they are talking to you, sometimes they'll pick up on a skill that you don't even recognize that you have and can recommend you to someone else. I think that's incredibly important, Mike, and thanks for sharing that. I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about a considerable portion of your life that you've spent at the intersection of academia and the military. And doing the bio, I know you wrote American National Security, and it really remains the ideal foundational text for courses in national security, foreign policy, and security studies. Honestly, be still my heart. I'm a big fan of that. So how do you combine the two fields, and what lessons have you learned from both professions?
It's sort of interesting as from my bio, the last part of my time in the military was spent as a professor at the military academy at West Point, in and out of deployment from Iraq and Afghanistan. And so it was kind of natural to work with my other colleagues there, Rachel Sondheimer and Suzanne Nielsen, to write American National Security, which, as you mentioned, is kind of the text that's provided for national security studies as well as for flag officers in the Army Strategic Education Program. The combining of the professions is really because I think it's important always to give back and always to be teaching and always be learning. It's kind of what you talked about networking. If you think you know everything, then you're probably not in the right position for any kind of job. You've got to be out there studying, testing your ideas, And in my view, I think each of us has a responsibility as part of the military profession to always be giving back. The future is educating the next generation. And instead of complaining about it, you can actually do something. In my case, it was writing a textbook, which, as much as you admire it, is 500 pages of prose, which is really important. But you're doing the same kind of thing with this podcast of candid leadership, transmitting knowledge from myself and other people so that the next generation can learn from the issues and affairs that we get involved in and then pass that on. And I think that's important about growing the next generation of leaders and what they're doing in the future.
Oh, that's totally brilliant. And the text itself, although it's a hearty 500 pages, I think it's worthwhile for those in national security to really go to that and check it out, because then you'll have a better understanding. What are senior leaders reading, absorbing, looking at? If you know what your boss's boss's boss is reading, that's important for you as you shape and understand how you will influence a decision maker. I've talked about that quite a bit on this podcast, is knowing what shape, size, and color you need to provide information for senior decision makers so that you can connect much faster and there isn't a barrier in communication. Are there any other lessons or insights from the text or any other things that you've written for listeners to work on their leadership skills?
I think you kind of touched on it there. The text addresses the areas, part of it is traveling around the Beltway. So it's got chapters on the intel community and the defense community and Congress and the presidency and the National Security Council, and then chapters on each of the elements of power. But in each of those, it talks about what it takes for strategic leadership, which is really having the situational awareness to understand what's going on, not just what you hear in the common reports. The second step is, where are you trying to take that organization from a strategic perspective, whether it's an organization, a company, a policy, or actually at the National Security Council with the nation? What is that big idea that you're trying to transmit? And then how do you communicate that strategically and then continue to improve yourself? And that kind of theme is conveyed in each of the different chapters to really give people the situational awareness and, in the United States case, where the American national security policy is going.
That's great advice. You've also spoken about other leadership and life lessons that you've learned from your experience and have applied these lessons as you've mentored across your career. As this podcast focuses not only on leadership, but also mentoring and being mentored, what advice would you give?
Well, I think the longest amount of time that I spent was as the professor and head of the Department of Social Sciences up at West Point. And that has the benefit of bringing in a group of great officers every year, along with the civilian faculty that are very talented. And we had a few things that I've adopted into my own personal leadership style. The motto of the department was "Be kind," which doesn't mean be easy on the students or just cave into things, but actually have a kind approach in everything that you're doing with your seniors, your subordinates, the people that you're working with. I think that's an important characteristic of a leader in everything that they do. And the second doctrine that we had was what we called the doctrine of no surprises, keeping everybody informed. And in fact, I found that this was particularly important in the military. And then when I took it into a civilian context in my current job at AAFMAA, making sure that everybody knows what's going on. You keep people from being surprised at various events. We all know it from the military, bad news does not get better with time. So the quicker that everybody finds out about what is going on, that can be very helpful in terms of your leadership approaches. So I think that those are kind of two of the key principles that I would say are important to any leaders.
Those points are absolutely fantastic, especially be kind. I most recently read something that said feedback is a gift. And I find that especially when we move around different agencies or organizations, even the Department of Defense, people understand the necessity for feedback or counseling or providing something to tell someone, hey, this is meeting the mark and this is an area of improvement. In the academic world, and that is a true culture of rejection when you look at things that you're submitted for peer-reviewed journals or publication, sometimes that moniker, I'm sure, Be Kind, was taken with a little grain of salt, but it was really important because you received feedback. And that part of leadership is truly monumental because you're helping to mentor someone and make them better. The doctrine of no surprises is fantastic in the fact that bad news does not get better with age. And none of us really want a strategic surprise. And especially speaking to the intelligence community leaders out there, we understand the importance of no desire for shock and awe at all, no surprises for your bosses, keeping them aware. So that doctrine of no surprises is really spot on. This has been a great discussion. Is there anything else you'd like to add or tell our listeners?
Well, let me just build a little bit on your talk about feedback. You and I have both had the opportunity to work for great senior leaders throughout our military careers, 3- and 4-star generals. And each of them, whenever I would go as the head of the Commander's Initiatives Group for either General Odierno or General Petraeus or General Allen or others, when they would go into a room, the important thing was they probably knew more about what was going on in those rooms than anybody else. But they also listened, because they weren't going to get any smarter if they were the one primarily transmitting in those rooms. And for the leaders that are listening to this podcast and others, an important part of that is to pay attention to the feedback from others, to recognize that the person with the highest rank is not necessarily the one with all the ideas, and you're not going to get any smarter in those rooms unless you're actually listening to that feedback. I think being able to learn from podcasts like this one, learn from your seniors, your subordinates, and others around you is an important technique, whether you're in the military, out of the military, or just in our daily lives. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you, Candace, and hope that your listeners got a lot out of this podcast.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. I really appreciate you listening to this conversation with Brigadier General Retired Mike Meese. If you want more candid perspectives on leadership, go to colonelcandid.com. As we mentioned in the beginning, I'm always up for recommended guests. Season 3 is full of great leaders and mentors recommended by you, the listener. I would also encourage you to share this podcast with your friends, colleagues, whoever you think would benefit from the information and wisdom shared by my amazing guests. I know I grow with every conversation, and I want to share that experience with as many leaders as we can. This show grows by word of mouth, so be sure to share this podcast. And please, if you think I've earned it, leave Candid Leadership a 5-star review on wherever you find yourself listening to this podcast. Thanks again for joining me. All views expressed are my own. I'm Colonel Candace Frost.